Just a quick background on me. As I said, I've been at Facebook for like a month, and I run the feed and stories of the Blue app, so the core product, which is an interesting job to have in the 2020 election, by the way, which is a whole other story. Prior to that, I was at a company called Credit Karma, and Credit Karma was a fintech company, and I was this chief product officer there for 4 years. And actually, Bill helped me connect to that role, so thank you. Speaking of executive recruiters. Prior to that, I was at Google, and I did a couple of products, Hangouts, and then the Google Photos app is mine. And so I did the product thing sort of the second chapter of my career. My first chapter was startup. So for 15 years, I did early stage, 0 to 1 kind of startup stuff. And I thought about what would be good advice. I realized that a lot of times, as you start putting yourself in the market, particularly in Silicon Valley, there are so many companies that come into your inbox. Like if you have a LinkedIn account, you're going to get a ton of them. If you're working with recruiters, you'll get more of them. Most of them, you don't recognize the names. And the question is, how do you know whether or not it's a good company? And more importantly, how do you know whether or not it's the right career move for you? So I wanted to put together a little bit of a framework for this, because it took me 6 months to make the decision to go to Facebook. And when I started out in tech, I used to think that, well, this is how companies get built. They get started out, and they start really small and early, and I'm using Series A and B as kind of like the funding milestones, and they just like pound it out, and they eventually build value. But it actually looks closer to this. And so what I describe, there's like kind of 4 phases of companies. And the reason why this is important is each phase could not be more different from itself. And each of those phases have totally different requirements as to the kind of talent. And my suspicion is for each and every one of you, one of those phases is dramatically better than another phase. And even Flea mentioned, there's such value in having experiences at multiple phases. That diversity just gives you more pages in your playbook to apply. So the 4 phases are basically the drunken walk, as I describe it, which is people are just trying to figure out what product people want. The product fit, which is you've kind of got things working. Hypergrowth, which I'd argue Gusto is at today, which is really growing because they've got something working, and they're worried about getting as much working as possible. And then finally scale, which is kind of the experience I'm having at Facebook now. So let me walk you through each of these, and I'll take questions as to how they apply. So the drunken walk I describe as, when you start a company, your job is to get as many things out in front of people as possible and to throw away as much that doesn't work as rapidly as you can, right? So think about that. You and a small number of people are constantly throwing things against the wall, and the speed in which you can throw things against the wall is highly correlated to finding something that customers want, right? So if you love structure, if you love hierarchy, if you love building foundation that's durable, this is a terrible phase for you. Right? Because what ultimately happens is the moment you get something kind of not working, you throw it away, and you're like, well, what if we had to push harder? What if you had to go further? So what I found is that, if you were, for example, I spent a lot of time thinking about product, and product people come to me and they're like, oh, there's a Series A company that's really early, I'd like to join them. I'm like, look, it's not a great fit for most product people because the founders are really driving a lot of what makes sense. Product people don't really have the same role as the engineers and the early salespeople that are trying to find those products. It's kind of a sideline role. And in fact, if you need a product person at this phase, you kind of wonder like, well, what's wrong with the company that the founders are not able to take advantage of that, right? Now, things flip, and they flip like a dime. Like one day you wake up and you're like, holy cow, customers seem to want what we built. I can't believe it. And now it's like, let's make sure that smoke turns into fire and doesn't go out. So think about the psychology of that organization. What used to be how rapidly can we throw and burn things down now turns into how do we protect it? How do we make sure that we put just the right process to make sure nothing blows up? How do I understand who these customers are and decide whether or not there's more of them, right? It's a completely different mentality. And now for the first time, new talent comes in, and their job is to say, well, let me figure out something that's predictable. Let me make sure that we have customer excellence. Let's think about what's happening in the market. Let's think about scaling the organization ever so slightly so that doesn't go away. Okay? Now you go to hypergrowth, and hypergrowth is the third and frankly a relatively new stage. 15 years, and there's this great quote which is LinkedIn took 10 years to get to the same scale as Uber took 18 months. And now we're even seeing more rapid growth, right? Why did this growth happen so rapidly? Well, mobile phones were a big part of it. The fact that you can put an app up in an app store and it can blow up overnight, that there are Google and Facebook or great marketing channels that you can really quickly see growth. So when you see that kind of growth, it changes again the nature of the company. Now when you're in hypergrowth, and there's a number of companies in the Valley that were hypergrowth. Bill and I actually had this conversation that when I was looking at Credit Karma 5 years ago, there was like 3 or 4 of those companies in a given year. Now there's like 12 or 15 of these hypergrowth companies. Hypergrowth companies are fascinating because they have something working, and their fear is to not only scale that as quickly as they're growing, but expand. Right? So how do I make my one product into multiple products? So people that come in here do tend to be innovators. They tend to be, let me go create something new. But if you create something new by ignoring what's working and just throwing stuff against the wall, you'll find yourself in a really tough situation, because hypergrowth companies also have to be able to do many things at the same time in one process, in one culture. And so the changes in the dynamics of a hypergrowth company requires this sort of entrepreneur at scale, right? So when you think about your own core skills, are you strong in soft skills? If you're strong in soft skills, hypergrowth is fantastic, because there you're trying to basically talk and negotiate and work with other teams, but at the same time be able to build yourself. But if you're much more like a process-oriented individual, the previous stage or the next stage might be more appropriate. Okay? And then the last one is scale, right? And scale is when we're challenged with innovator's dilemma. Innovator's dilemma means like, when you get to a certain point of scale, the process you've done is you've become so incremental in how you've optimized the business that the idea of creating new doesn't really get that space, right? That is actually the conversation that Facebook had with me. Facebook had with me is they said, look, we have one of the most successful, and I'd argue the second most successful consumer service that man's ever created, Google Search as being the other one, right? So these are multiple billions of people use this product, and yet their whole interest is we want to change it, right? And so it's hard to change something that's working so well. So usually what people do when they get into this phase is usually excellent at managing inside the building problems. Problems where a bunch of people need to get together to make smaller changes, but very powerful changes because it's such scale. And ultimately, they also find innovators who like basically changing something culturally when they're actually at the highest levels, right? So why I use this framework is that when you get that recruiter call, when you look at that company, the question you should ask yourself is this phase of company the right phase for me? Will it bring out my best talents? Will it make me my best self? Or is this the phase that I need to add, as Flea mentioned, to be able to bring a diverse enough background to my talent set so that I can go get that big job? Because when I started interviewing, what resonated with people wasn't how many people I'd managed, and it actually wasn't even the products and the success that I had. It was how many different types of environments and stages had you experienced? And so when I could sit down and say, well, that makes sense because at hypergrowth you need to change this, but at entrepreneur 0 to 1 you need to create this. People were like, okay, whatever our environment is going to resonate with you because our environment is unlike anything out there. So the more diverse backgrounds you have, the better chance it is that you will land and do well with it. Okay, so I'll pause there. I'll take questions. Who's got a question? Yeah, go for it. I'll repeat it.
So both hypergrowth and scale, like you have in here as two distinct things, but what do you do if you're a company that is sort of straddling both areas? And you're already at scale, but you still need hypergrowth to sort of sustain your dominance or your scale. So let's just take, for example,
a company called Uber?
Yeah.
Yeah, so hypothetically Uber. Okay, got it. Okay, so it's a very good question. So actually, the nuance of it is most organizations, like take a company like Uber or a company like Google, actually it's better to look at where is the project in its phase, right? So a company like Facebook, I just use that as a simple example, has something like the feed, which is used by billions of people, and Instagram, which is growing, and WhatsApp, which is used by a lot of people, and then something called Libra. And Libra is yet to come out, right? I think there was a discussion on Libra yesterday, right? So what's interesting about companies is oftentimes the largest of companies has a portfolio of projects that are at different phases, okay? Having said that, typically what I find is that there is some fundamental genetics about how an organization goes. It's not the case that you can, the statement in the Valley that I've most shrieked from is that, oh, XYZ company, they run just like a startup. No company runs like a startup except for a startup. They just don't. And so no matter how you cut it, when you get to scale, you have hiring process, you have resource allocation, you have some fundamentals that you have to have skill to manage the inside the building problems. And really what the spectrum just says is how much time and skill do you need to have to manage the inside the building problems versus outside. And in fact, I used to ask that to my team. It's like, what percentage of time are you spending outside the building and thinking about that problem versus inside? And that outside versus inside ratio is highly correlated with where you're on the spectrum. And I think that doesn't matter whether you are in a 0 to 1 project, in the example I gave of Libra, whether you're in a late stage project. But you can definitely take your current company and move into different elements of entrepreneurship, innovation, and structure. And that is valuable because being able to be in sometimes you don't want to leave the company, but you want some diverse experience. Bouncing around can be very, very additive. Other questions? Yeah.
So, thank you. What happens if you find that maybe your company got through the first 2 or 3 phases, and then it starts going in the other direction, like on the decline? Maybe they got that chief hyper growth by accident, or like there was no other option, and then the options came. So, like, what do you do? What do you advise to someone young in their career who doesn't want to waste a whole lot of time?
Okay, great question. So. And the question is that this picture points the upward trajectory. What happens when you go down? So I think that this is, and I won't ask you where you work. So what I would say is that's such an insightful question because 99% of companies don't go from one gate to another, right? So 99 out of 100 startups never get past the product fit stage. So it's not like this is just like, oh, if you just wait it out, it'll end up working out. Okay, so what the best advice that I got on that question is like one of the first pieces of advice that my uncle, who was a very successful entrepreneur, gave me. And he's like, if you join a company, the thing you want to hope for is either rapid growth or rapid decline. But the flatlining is the worst. Because in the flat case, you're kind of not in a position to learn because you're primarily just doing more of the same. But if you're rapidly growing, we can all agree that growth hides a lot of problems, but growth also teaches a lot of stuff. But decline is actually not so terrible, and here's why. Let's assume that I'm working for a company that's really struggling, right? And I'm an IC or I'm earlier, maybe mid-level in my career. Well, all of a sudden, I get battlefield promoted. Why? Because my boss decides that, hey, maybe this isn't the right thing for his or her career. And now I'm disproportionately getting management. And that may be because no one else will take the job, okay? But the moment I step away from my ego, I'm like, look, at the end of the day, this is incredibly valuable experience that I actually am learning at an incredibly fast rate. The worst case is, well, my boss isn't going anywhere, and I'm basically doing the same job. And in 12 months, it'll roughly be the same job, and we'll be from version 3 to version 4. And the environment is will be number 3 in the competitive landscape, not number 2. That's the terrible spot, because learning is the most critical thing. I mean, I'll ask this question, I was going to mention this. How are we doing on time, by the way? Okay, let me just take a poll of hands. Okay, if you were to look at money, because money's been brought up a few times, and you're to ask yourself, by the age of 40, okay, what percentage of your overall wealth do you think you'll have accumulated? Okay, so in other words, if you think you'll go to the grave or your highest point of net worth will be $1 million, what percentage of that $1 million do you have by the age of 40? How many people think it's 50% or more? Okay, a few people. Okay, there's no wrong answer. How many people think it's like 30% or more? How many people think it's 10% or more? The answer is 5%. You ask anyone who's in their 40s, they will tell you, this is the most unobvious stat, that turns out you only make about 5% of your wealth. This is also the case with impact. You know, the most impact you have is in your 40s. And why? Because you're just young enough that you still get gas in the tank, but you can manage. You can have much greater impact. So the question you should ask yourself from age 25 to 40 is, if I set myself up to have the best 40 to 50s, because 95% of your impact come after the age of 40. And if you don't invest effectively, what you'll end up doing is saying, I gotta get this promotion, I gotta get this bigger job, all this other stuff. But you really wanna play the long game, get that 40 to 50. And so diversity of different companies, different experiences sets you up, because you know, I think that all of us that have had successful careers, we make, and just money is just one proxy, more impact and more dollars in a week than I certainly made in my first few years, in some cases, when I was starting out. And that's okay, because that's the way it works. But no one thinks that way when they're in their 20s and 30s, and that I hope you think about when you take the next job. Thank you.